بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد خير الأولين والآخرين وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا، وأكرمنا ولا تهنا، وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا، وآسرنا ولا تؤثر علينا، واطلع عنا وأرضنا يا رب العالمين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Money Matters. This is a 2-day webinar being brought to you by the Lamppost Education Initiative. And today, inshallah, the plan is to cover the topic of Riba. Riba. We want to talk about the proper understanding of Riba. What did Riba mean during the pre-Islamic period? And what Islam introduced to the understanding of Riba, various issues related to the matters of Riba. That's it would be good to talk about the concept of Riba, the understanding of Riba, because, of course, as we know, this is something that Muslims pay a lot of attention to, and there's a lot of talk about it. There is understanding and misunderstanding that exists with respect to Riba. And hopefully today we'll be able to clear up a lot of the misunderstandings and perhaps enrich your understanding further than what you already may have, inshallah. So what is Riba? Riba, we want to begin by reciting or focusing on the most important verses with respect to Riba. And those happen in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah, second chapter of the Quran, beginning with verse 275, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم الذين يأكلون الربا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. Those who devour riba will not stand except as stands one whom the evil one by his touch hath driven to madness. That is because they say, trade is, but Allah hath permitted trade and forbidden riba. Now, the reason that I've chosen not to translate the word riba is because we actually don't have, at least to my knowledge, an exact synonym for the word in the English language. Most of the time when people, they translate riba as interest. But in the finance sector, what one needs to understand is that interest is a word which sometimes it qualifies as an exact synonym for what we generally think to be riba, then at other times it doesn't. Sometimes the word interest simply means profit. It simply means the markup, or in other words, the additional money that a particular individual is charging you for the purchase of an item, let's say, for instance, long term. Let's say I want to sell you my phone. And I say that, okay, well, if you give me $500 right now, it's yours. But if you want a payment plan over a year, it's going to cost you $800. Now, that additional $300 in our current system, often in the documents and legal documents, is listed as interest. It's called interest. But from a purely Islamic perspective, that actually is not haram. It is halal for you to charge whatever price that you deem to be, your item or your particular good to be, worth. And so if the other individual is willing to pay that same price, then it's not a problem at all. Right. So even though they call it interest, it doesn't mean that it's haram in that situation. That interest in that particular example is simply a synonym for markup or profit. Right. So we'll come back to this. But this verse 275 says, those who devour riba will not stand except as one who has been driven to madness by shaitan. And that is because they say, that trade إنما البيع مثل الربا, that trade is just like riba. Whilst Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made trade to be lawful, but he's made riba to be unlawful. But then he goes on and says, فَمَنْ جَاءَهُ مَوْعِظَةٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ فَانْتَهَى فَلَهُ مَا سَلَفَ وَأَمْرُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَمَنْ عَادَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَا وَيُرْبِي الصَّدَقَاتِ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ كَفَّارٍ أَثِيمٍ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَوُا الزَّكَاةَ فَلَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِندَ رَبِّهِمْ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. Whoever gives this up when admonition from his Lord comes to him, let bygones be bygones. In other words, that whatever happened is what happened. Just don't repeat it in the future. So whoever gives up riba when admonition from his Lord comes to him, let bygones be bygones. His case is up to God. But those who repeat are inmates of the hellfire wherein they remain. God deprives usury of blessing and grants increase for charities. And God does not love any ungrateful sinners. As for those who believe and do good works and pray regularly and give charity, they have their reward with their Lord, and no fear will weigh on them, and they will not sorrow. Now, in this particular situation, this instance, we notice that the translation, this is not my translation, this is the translation of Thomas Cleary. So in this particular instance, he translates riba as usury. Once again, I don't like to translate riba as usury because usury quite often fundamentally it means just simply what we call compound interest. Right? In other words, it may be legally valid to charge, let's say, 2% interest on a particular law, according to a particular system. But they may classify 5% interest as usury. And so it now becomes forbidden for you to charge it. But Islam forbids both the 5% and the 2%. And so usury itself is not the best to translate or as a direct synonym for riba either. Right. But then it continues. So the Quran continues where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وذروا ما بقي من الربا إن كنتم مؤمنين فإن لم تفعلوا فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله وإن تبتم فلكم رؤوس أموالكم لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون من كان ذو عسرة فنظيرة إلى ميسرة وأن تصدقوا خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون واتقوا يوما ترجعون فيه إلى الله ثم توفى كل نفس ما كسبت وهم لا يظلمون. O you who believe, be conscious of God and disperse what remains of usurious interest if you are believers. And if you do not, then take heed of war from God and God's messenger. But if you repent, you may have your capital. Do not be unfair, and you will not be treated unfairly. If someone is in straits, wait until it is convenient. And if you remit the debt as charity, that is better for you if you only knew. And be conscious of the day when you will be returned to God. Then every soul will be requited for what it has earned, and they will not be wrong. Now, these number of verses are very interesting, and not only interesting, but this particular verse is the only verse in the Quran where we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he announces war against the sinner. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he threatens with punishment for committing sin, but there's no sin in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually announces or declares war on a person for practicing that sin other than the commission of riba or the charging of what we call riba. So I wanted to go through these verses to begin with, and keep in mind too that these verses in Surah Al-Baqarah are considered to be among the last of the verses of the Quran revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially the very last one, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ, and be conscious of the day when you will be returned to God. That particular verse is said to be, according to a very strong opinion, the very last verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ, and then every soul will be requited for what it has earned, and they shall not be wrong. So this is, of course, the introduction to the topic, of course, who is the foundation of our understanding with respect to riba. Now, riba was something practiced in the early period of Islam. I'm sorry, but prior to the coming of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, riba was well known to the Arabs. And in the Muwatta ibn Malik, he relates the following from Zayd ibn Arqam, radiallahu an, where he said that riba of the pre-Islamic days was for a man to be owed a right by another man due upon the deadline. So once the deadline came, he would say, will you pay what is due now or add to the debt later? If he paid what is due, he would take it. If not, he would add to what is due while delaying until the deadline. Imam al-Tabari, similarly, he mentions a description of the pre-Islamic days and what is called riba al-jahiliyyah, and some refer to as riba al-nasi'ah. And so in this particular case, he relates on the authority of Abdurrahman ibn Zayd ibn Aslam regarding Allah's statement, do not devour riba in multiplied doubles, la ta'kuru riba ad'afan muda'afa, which we're going to discuss in a second. So in this situation, this instance, the son of Zayd ibn Aslam, the Tabi'i, who was the son of the Sahabi, he said, my father Zayd used to say that the only riba there was during the pre-Islamic period was that found in doubling debt by the year. A man would have the balance of the debt owed, and one would go to him when the deadline expired and say, will you repay or increase me? If he had something with which to repay, he would repay. Otherwise, he would transfer it to the next highest age. That is, if it happened to be a 1-year-old camel, he would make it one that was 2 years old, then a 3-year-old, then a 4-year-old, and then a 5-year-old. In other words, people would lend camels to one another. In other words, they say, well, camel for camel, right? I'm going to give you a 1-year-old camel, and you're going to return to me a 1-year-old camel next year around the same time. And when that time came on the following year, if the individual didn't have that 1-year-old camel, the individual who originally gave him the camel would say, okay, well, now you owe me a 2-year-old camel. And this is because of the delay in payment. So because the 2-year-old camel was more valuable than the 1-year-old camel, right? And the 3-year-old is more valuable than the 2-year-old, and the 4 value, and the 5 more valuable than the 4 or 3-year-old, et cetera, right? So this is why he's mentioned it. And then he say, and this would continue in succession and with respect to currency that comes to him. So if one did not have any, he would double it into the coming year. Then if he still did not have any, he would double it again, inasmuch that if it was 100 owed, he would make it 200 at a future date. Then if he did not have it, he would make it 400, doubling it every year, or he would repay it. So you owe me $100. I say, you pay me back next month, $100. When the next month comes, okay, you don't have it. Now you owe me $200. You pay me the second month. But they would do this annually. It would be usually by year. So you owe me, let's say, 500 dirhams. And so next year around the same time comes, you don't have my 500 dirhams. Now I say, okay, now you owe me 1,000 dirhams. Right. Then the following year, you don't have my 1,000 dirhams. I said, now you owe me 2,000 dirhams. Right. So they continue to double it year after year in that particular way, in that particular fashion. Right. So this is what we call riba al-jahiliyyah or riba al-nasi'ah. Right. And this was the state of riba prior to the coming of the Prophet. And fundamentally, what we see is a combination between a doubling of the amount owed in light of, well, not a combination, but rather a doubling of the amount owed in light of the delayed payment or the late payment itself. And so in one sense, when you think of riba, you can think of it, probably the simplest way to think of riba is a late payment charge on a loan given to an individual. Right? So I lend you money, or I leave you some other item, right? An item of barter, and I ask you to repay it to me, but then at a certain date, and then when that date comes, you don't have it, then I charge you extra, right? Adding an additional burden on top of that. Of course, in the old days, people would often go seeking loans because they themselves were poor. Right. So the poor person is going to go to a rich person seeking a loan because you're poor. Naturally, you don't have it. So the rich person is expected to show some goodwill to that poor person. But what happens here is that the rich person, the person who's well-to-do, actually gives them the loan, the act of goodwill, but then creates an additional burden on that individual. And of course, and if this continues to multiply year after year after year, as we see happening in our own system, especially when it comes to something, let's say, for instance, like, the educational loans, school loans, right, for going to university and things like that, student loans, we call it. So typically, I mean, this is increasing year after year. Somebody may only borrow $8,000 and 5 years, 8 or 10 years later, they owe $16,000 if they haven't paid anything on it. Or sometimes, quite often, if you don't pay, even if you do pay something on it, if it's a very small amount, right? So fundamentally, this is a big problem, as we know, as we can see. But riba in the Jahiliyyah period this is the state of the riba in the Jahiliyyah period. But when Islam came, Islam actually introduced understanding of what we constitute as riba. In Surah Al-Imran, verse 130, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la ta'kulu riba ad'afan mudha'afa wattaqullaha la'allakum tuflihun. Believers, do not consume usurious interest multiplied and compounded, and be conscious of God that you may thrive. Now, this particular verse I wanted to highlight it because, unfortunately, too often in my experience, that there have been Muslims who are attempted to justify the charging and the paying of riba, stating that or claiming that the Quran, it only makes a big deal out of compound interest, right? Which this would be the foundation of that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't devour it, multiply it and compound it. Right? So that means compound interest is haram, but simple interest is not. And I've actually had brothers say this to me in the past. But when you look at the tafsir of this particular verse, you see that pretty much every mufassir is very clear and in agreement that this qualifier of afa muda'afa in the ayah itself does not mean that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is stipulating or making this a stipulation that it has to be compounded in order for it to be a riba, right? Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just simply mentioning this because it was the custom, right, already in the Jahili period, that when a person had a late payment, that they would compound the debt that was owed to the original lender, right? And so he's mentioning that, just, okay, well, this is the custom, this is the norm. And so this should be taken in the same way that one would take things such as the verse that mentions that, that la tukrihu fatayatikum ala bigha'i in aradna tahsuna, that do not compel slave girls to fornication or into prostitution. Don't compel slave girls into prostitution if they desire to be chaste. So that part about if they desire to be chaste, we shouldn't say, okay, well, what if they don't desire to be chaste? Islam, it doesn't say that it's permissible for you to compel your slave girl to be a prostitute, right? If she's okay with it, that is simply mentioned as the norm. It's the hukm al-ghalib, right? It's the taghlib. It's the hukm al-taghlib, in that it was the norm that men would do so, right? That they would compel these women to be prostitutes, even though they themselves, those women, did not want to become prostitutes. So that is not to say that this is a condition to make what makes it actually haram, and in the absence of a condition that it would be halal. No, prostitution is haram under all conditions. In the same way, when it comes to riba here in this particular verse, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about you don't consume usurious interest multiplied and compounded, it's not to say that it is only haram if it's multiplied and compounded. It is haram whether it be multiplied and compounded or be in the simplest form. So 2% is the same as 5% interest. It doesn't matter. And this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or rather a statement of the Sahabi Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu, where he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, la'ana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam akil al-riba wa munkilahu wa katibuhu wa shahidayhi, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cursed the one who profits from riba, the one who pays it to him, the one who records it, and those who witness it. He said they are all the same with respect to it, meaning that they all share a sin. This is how serious this particular sin is. Is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cursed even the individual who witnesses the contract of riba, right? Is that so he was very much against it. In this, we saw the Quran says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his or against the individual who continues to deal who transact with condition of riba or lend with riba as a stipulation. Now, in the Prophet's Hijjatul Wada, among the things that he mentioned, he listed that we can consider to be among his final legacy was that he abolished riba as well. Of course, Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already said made it forbidden, but the Prophet ﷺ, he took an extra step, right? And he mentioned in that particular khutbah, إن ربا الجاهلية موضوع كله وأول ربا أضعه ربانا ربا العباس بن عبد المطلب فإنه موضوع كله. That verily all the riba of the pre-Islamic days is abolished. And the first riba I abolish is our riba, meaning the riba of Banu Hashim, the riba of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was his uncle. In other words, that Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, during his pre-Islamic days, then when he lent money and items to people, that he would stipulate that they repay him with riba. So the Prophet ﷺ, of course, being an exemplary, went to show, okay, well, I can give it up, and my uncle is not going to be able to demand anything more than the capital, anything more than the seed money that he had given to those individuals for the projects they had, or just simply whatever monies that were given to alleviate their burdens. Right? So for it is abolished in its entirety. So the Prophet ﷺ, he abolished riba. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the verse we just read, يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَا وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ كَفَّارٍ أَثِيمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he obliterates riba and he makes charity grow. And he doesn't like any sinful person, right? So riba, when we talk about riba, then linguistically, the word riba, it is synonymous with what we call a ziyada. It just means increase. And so this was the point of confusion between the people of Bani Thaqif, about whom the verse 275 was revealed, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions that, that's because they say that riba is just like the trade is the same as riba, right? So where they say, okay, well, in trade you make profit, in riba you make profit, right? Because riba means ziyada, it means increase. That's all. So why is the increase haram, right? We say the increase is halal when it comes to regular trade. So why can I charge extra in light of the time factor, right, between when I give my money away or give my property away and when it returns to me, right? Why can I charge something extra? Because that's an inconvenience for me. That's an inconvenience for me that I've given an individual, let's say, $1,000. And I say, okay, you have to repay me in 6 months. There's a possibility that my money may not return to me, right? Because when you think about this, it's somewhat reasonable. It's like, okay, well, why can't I charge something in light of that potential loss, right? Or the fact that it's an immediate loss right now. I'm $1,000 poorer than I was just a second ago when I gave this individual my $1,000. Now, of course, Islam said, no, you're not poorer. You're actually richer now because you gave more. Because charity makes you rich. It doesn't make you poor. Right? But it means, that's this origin of the word itself. But Islam came and said, well, goodwill in lending is compulsory, that you are not allowed to charge extra when you're lending something to someone, right? So goodwill lending becomes compulsory. And even though there is an inconvenience for you, right? But this is ultimately something better for you. It actually is an increase in your wealth. It is not a decrease in your wealth. It is an increase in your wealth when you lend your money to, especially to those who have needs. So riba can be defined as a loan or currency with a predetermined profit or late fee in light of the delayed payment. So in other words, if I give you, for instance, a bag of apples, and I say, I want a bag of apples tomorrow, right? Even though that transaction is not deemed to be halal, for you to do food for food, that's, something we can talk about later. But let's think of a better example. Let's say, If I give you, I exchange for you, let's say, um, um, I'm trying to avoid utilizing cash too, as an example, right? Rather than, because cash, we're definitely dealing with cash. But since it's easy, let's say cash. Okay, let's say that that I give you $100, you return $100 to me, right? So, or if I give you a bike, right, and you give me $100 tomorrow, it's not a problem, right? So the in exchange of assets, and we consider, let's say that the cash value of that bike, is an equal substitute for the bike itself, right? But when it comes to an item or an asset, and the thing that is being traded is time, right? Time is not a tangible. It is not a valid intangible in order to validate the additional charge. And to validate, it's not a utility. It's not the time itself has no utility, has no usufruct, right? In the sense that, let's say, for instance, if a person was a security guard, right, and you're paid per hour, you're paid for your presence on the campus or the location where you've been hired to actually stand and wait, and of course to discourage any potential crime coming to that particular location. That gets considered to be a valid intangible service being offered by you. But money itself doesn't have any time value or any usufruct itself, or in other words, that the time itself, as one waits for one's money, has no particular usufruct. It has no utility itself, which can be a valid basis for a charge, right? So this is fundamentally what this means. So riba is a loan of an asset, right? Such as, again, it can be a crop, it can be food, it can be clothing, it can be furniture, it can be a hammer, whatever it may be. A loan of an asset, or it could be or currency with a predetermined profit or late fee in light of the delayed payment. Now, it's important that when we talk about riba, that we also talk about the issue of debt overall, because we live in a time of, I think we can actually classify as a time of neo-slavery. And so the neo-slavery in the sense that in the past, people became slaves in different ways, right? So we know, of course, the most common way that a person became a slave in the past was through warfare, that your side loses the war, and the winning side has the opportunity or the option of killing you, of letting you go free, or ransoming you back to your tribe, or they can make you a slave, right? And then, of course, decide whether or not to set you free before you pass away. And so this was the world, right, for most of human history. But the other ways that you became a slave were either through kidnap, or through subsistence slavery, and through debt slavery, right? So debt slavery is subsistence slavery. In other words, that you don't have enough food to live. Therefore, I'm going to go find an individual who's well-to-do, and I'm going to offer my services and say, hey, I'll work your land for you if you give me a certain percentage of the crop. So subsistence slavery, worked that way. Or debt slavery would be again, you borrow some money, or you borrow some good or some assets from someone, and then you lack the ability to repay it. And so you become an indentured servant. In other words, someone who has to work off your debt. Okay? So once you worked a particular amount of time, then you're now set free. Right. So we live in a particular time where for many, many people on the planet, and because of the wide availability of credit, that people technically live as subsistence slaves or debt slaves. And during COVID, this was revealed or manifests better than any other time, I would say, in that, think about it like this. You have a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage. You have one or two cars, which you have car notes, which 4 or 5 years. You also have credit card debt. You may have student loan debt. you have medical expenses, you might have a child or one or two who actually just went off to college, and you're also helping them pay their tuition. So pretty much all of your money is going towards paying off bills and paying off debts. It's very difficult for many people in the country, in Western countries, especially in Western countries, to actually save any money, to actually save anything because of this state. And then what happens is COVID comes, and people are given an option, they're given a choice. Hey, listen, either you take this jab or you're going to get fired. Now, think of that individual who actually has that mortgage and has those car notes and has those student loan debt and has credit card debt, etc. What do you think the person's going to do? The person doesn't have any good choices. In other words, you're an indentured servant. You're a debt slave, fundamentally. That's really what you are at that moment and at that time. And so the reason that I think is extremely important to bring up the importance of debt in this context is because while there's often a focus on the problems with interest and the problem with user in our system, but we don't talk a whole lot about the very fact that the Prophet ﷺ, he discouraged Muslims from incurring debt, right? So he discouraged people from charging interest or riba, but he also discouraged those people who actually are looking for loans from seeking out loans to the extent that they incur massive amounts of debt. Now, you have to do what you have to do, but it should not become a habit. And we live in a situation where the actual luxury that we see ourselves, that we live in, is all the result of the fact that we have easy access to what we call liquidity or credit, right? That the fact that the credit system exists has made it possible for us to live like kings and queens in our particular time, right? And so when people in many parts of the world are not able to live like we do because they don't have access to liquidity or this credit that makes it possible for us to live the way that we live, and so technically we're rich, but at the same time we're poor, and that we're rich in that we're able to, or we have access to many different items, many different assets, which actually give us the capacity to extract some use from it. All right, because that's ultimately what ownership is about, right? You want to own things because they do something for you. They have a usufruct value, right? But we are things, but we don't own the assets themselves quite often. But other peoples in many parts of the world, the poor parts of the world, we call the third world, or sometimes the second world, one of the main reasons why they're not able to live the way that we live is because they don't have access to credit, right? And that is key here. I think is extremely important, And then when crises begin, so we just had an international crisis that should have awakened everyone to the realization that we're not as rich as we actually think we are. If someone can force us to do something that we really don't want to do because we're so indebted, then that in itself means we're truly not free. We're truly not free, right? So this particular, there's a hadith with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, "والذي نفسي بيده لو أن رجلا قتل في سبيل الله ثم أحيي ثم قتل ثم أحيي ثم قتل وعليه دين ما دخل الجنة حتى يقضى عليه دينه." That by the one in whose hand is my soul, if a man was to be killed in the way of Allah, brought back to life, killed again, brought back to life, and then killed again, he would not enter paradise until his debt is repaid. So the borrower is the slave of the lender, as Proverbs 22:7 states, right? So this is an extremely important thing for us to consider when we think about the question of riba. So riba is bad, but incurring a lot of debt also is bad. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he talks about riba. So this first hadith is considered to be pivotal, and here we get a glimpse at Islam's contribution to the concept of riba. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "الذهب بالذهب والفضة بالفضة والبر بالبر والشعير بالشعير والتمر بالتمر والملح بالملح مثلا بمثل يدا بيد فمن زاد واستزاد فقد أربى وآخذ منه والمعطي فيه سواء. The Prophet said, gold for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, dates for dates, and salt for salt are to be exchanged equal for equal, hand to hand. So whoever gives or asks for more has devoured riba. The taker and giver are equal in it, meaning equal in the sin. So what Hadith establishes is what we call the foundations of riba, usul al-riba. And so there are multiple narrations of the same Hadith, and the Prophet mentions the same 6 items: gold, silver, wheat, barley, dates, and salt. So they are the foundations of riba, meaning that anything that we are to apply the rules of riba to, that they originate from these 6 goods. In other words, they are analogized with these 6 goods. So these 6 goods are what we call analogs for anything else that we would classify as riba. But then the ulama, we're going to see later, they differ about what the fundamental reason is why the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he classified these things or listed these things as riba assets. It's riba assets, fundamental reason there. No, so when Islam comes, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam introduces 2 different types of riba. Right, one is called riba al-fadl, and the other called riba al-nasa. In other words, in addition to what had already been known amongst the Jahili Arabs, where they would charge or they would compound the debt itself for each year that the individual did not repay it. That, and so in light of that delayed payment, so it's a combination of a delay and an increase. Right? So because of the delay, there was an increase. But in the Shari'ah of the Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Shari'ah Muhammadiyah, we find that there is a riba of increase and a riba of delay. Whereas for the Jahilis, it was an increase in light of the delay. Here we have a situation where there's an increase, a riba because of an increase or a disproportionate exchange between certain items. And then there's a riba or something classified as riba because of those items being exchanged at later date. The items are expected to be exchanged in the same sitting, and if they're not exchanged in the same sitting, then they will be classified as riba. And the injunction where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares war on that individual for dealing with riba would apply. So riba al-fadl, the first one, riba al-fadl. In this regard, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, لا تبيعوا الذهب بالذهب إلا مثلا بمثل ولا تشفوا بعضه على بعض ولا تبيعوا الورق بالورق إلا مثلا بمثل ولا تشفوا بعضه على بعض ولا تبيعوا منه غائبا بناجز. Do not sell gold for gold unless it is equal for equal, and do not exchange some of it for a greater amount for the other. Do not sell silver for silver unless it is equal for equal, and do not exchange some of it for a greater amount for the other. Also, do not sell from it something that is absent from what is present. So we find here riba al-fadl, focus, of course, on the increase, but at the end of the hadith, he also mentions something about delay. So this hadith is reported by Imam Muslim in his Sahih. Other hadiths in the same regard, we find the Prophet ﷺ in this other narration says, date for date, week for week, barley for barley, salt for salt are to be exchanged equal for equal, hand to hand. So whoever adds or asks for an increase has devoured riba, except for when they are of different kind, then it is permissible to exchange in different amounts. فإذا اختلفت الأجناس فبيعوا كيف شئتم إذا كان يدا بيد. So that is riba al-fadl. The other type of riba, which was introduced by Islam, is what's called riba al-nasa. So in this regard, we find 2 hadiths also in the Sahih of Imam Muslim, and there are other hadiths or different narrations of the same hadith. So one of the hadiths, the first of them reads, gold for silver is riba illa, unless it is ha'a wa ha'an ha'a. In other words, so this is an expression that the Arabs would utilize when they meant take this, take that, ha'a, ha'a, right? In other words, gold for silver is riba unless they are given in the same sitting. That's really what this means, right? So at the same time, I'm going to give you gold, some gold for that silver, right? But what you cannot do is say, well, I'm going to give you the gold today and then you bring me the silver tomorrow. So fundamentally, the Prophet ﷺ is saying in this situation, even though they are not of the same species, gold is not of the same species as silver, but they are of the same class, right? Both of them belong to the same class. And this is what this hadith teaches us, is that when the two items belong to the same class, then they cannot be exchanged with delay, right? They have to exchange in the same sitting. So gold for silver is riba unless it is ha'a wa ha'a. Wheat for wheat is riba unless it is ha'a and ha'a. Barley for barley is riba unless it is ha'a and ha'a. And dates for dates is riba unless it is ha'a and ha'a. And then another narration is that gold for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, dates for dates, and salt for salt ought to be exchanged while being like for like, equal for equal, hand to hand. But when these categories are different from one another, then sell them as you wish when it is hand to hand without delay. So riba al-fadl, riba al-nasa. Right. So those are the two primary categories of riba, which are listed by the ulama in the books of fiqh: riba al-fadl, riba al-nasa. So the riba of increase and riba of delay. And so the riba of increase fundamentally means that certain items, you're not allowed to exchange them in disproportionate amounts with one another. So if I give you 1 kilo of wheat, then you have to exchange with me 1 kilo of wheat. Right? If 1 kilo of dates, 1 kilo of dates. 1 kilo of salt for 1 kilo of salt. Right? 10 gold coins for 10 gold coins. Right? They cannot be disproportionate. So if there is disproportion, if you give me 11 gold coins for 10 gold coins, then that is riba and fadl. If you give me 2 kilos of wheat for 1 kilo of wheat, then that, right? And then riba and nasa is when you're talking about the delay, right? So in other words, gold and silver belong to the same class. And we're going to come back to this, inshallah, very soon. They belong to a single class, right? And so when the items belong to the same class, even though you're allowed to exchange them at disproportionate amounts, I might give you 10 pieces of silver for 1 piece of gold, but you still have to exchange them in the same sitting. They have to be in the same sitting. They cannot be in two separate sittings, right? So that is riba nasa. So in summary, we get from these hadiths what we call the rules of riba. So the rule number 1 is that it is unlawful to transact riba assets of the same species disproportionately. In other words, same species meaning they're the same exact item, right? So a piece of silver is equal to another piece of silver. $1 is equal to $1. $1 bill is the same as $1 bill. $5 bill is the same as $5 bills, right? So it is unlawful to transact the riba assets of the same species disproportionately. In other words, I can't give you $1 bill for $2 bills because that's riba. They belong to the same species. Rule number 2, it is unlawful to delay the transaction of riba assets of the same class. So first we talk about species and now we talk about class. So class is the super category. In other words, so gold and silver, they belong in the genus or the class of currency. Let's say, for instance, right? So they belong to the class of currencies. And because of them belonging to that class, according to those who hold this viewpoint, that this being the reason why this being the particular class they belong to, although I can trade 1 for 10, I'm not allowed to make the exchange at a later date, right? They have to exchange at the same time, right? Well, why? The fundamental reason is because the individual who is expected to return with the loan may not return, right? And then the first party may be robbed, right? As a result of that. So rule number 3, it is lawful to transact assets of different classes and different species disproportionately. So in other words, we talked about gold and silver already. So gold and silver belong to the same class, but they are 2 different species, right? So I can exchange 10 to 1, right? Or wheat and dates belong to the same class, but they are 2 different species. So I would have to give the same amount or same weight of my gold as I do for the same weight of dates as I do for my wheat. They belong to different species, but the same class. But I'm not allowed to exchange them at different dates. Right? They have to be exchanged in the same city. It's already stated in the earlier rule. And then rule number 4: it is lawful to delay the transaction of riba assets of different classes. In other words, gold and silver belong to one class. Dates, wheat, barley, and salt belong to a different class. So I can exchange them disproportionately, right, from one another, but I also can exchange them at delay. So in other words, I can give you $10 today, and you bring me my dates tomorrow. That's halal, right? Why? Because they don't belong to the same class. They don't belong to the same class. It is only haram to delay the exchange when they belong to the same class. So if I delay my salt from my date, then I'm guilty of riba. Right? But if I exchange salt for gold, then I'm not guilty of riba, because gold belongs to one class and my salt belongs to a different class. Right? So in other words, it's a bit technical, but this fundamental. These are the rules that we learn. So in summary, we talked about 3 different types of riba to this point. So riba and nasi'ah, or riba al-jahiliyyah, in other words, the state of riba prior to the advent of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is called riba al-jahiliyyah, or called riba al-nasi'ah. Now, there's some ulama who actually utilize nasi'ah to mean nasa, which is the second type of riba. So riba al-jahiliyyah, if we remember, fundamentally it was the increase in the amount owed in light of the delayed return, right? So the late fee charged for a particular asset that was given to the borrower. So nisa, riba jahiliya, riba nasi'ah. Then riba nasa, this is the riba of delayed. And then riba of fadl, riba of disproportionate exchange, or riba of increase. Now, again, coming back, so we have 2 fundamental classes that the items mentioned in this hadith they belong to. So class number 1, gold and silver fall under class number 1. Class number 2, wheat, barley, dates, and salt fall under that class. And then here, what other forms? This is where it gets very sticky, because often Muslims, when they talk about riba, they talk about it as if it's black and white. That is easy matter to resolve, right? But it's not easy to resolve, because the ulama, everybody's reading the same material. They read the same hadith, and they have different conclusions that they've drawn about certain types of things, right? So if you're a literalist, a Zahiri, like Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, then you have nothing to worry about, because nothing is riba other than the 6 items mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nothing is subject to the rules of riba other than those 6 items, according to the Zahiris, right? So if you're living today, nothing to worry about. There's no riba unless you're exchanging those 6 items, and you go back to those 4 rules that we just went over. Then, according to those 4 rules, then you would be guilty of riba if you violate those rules with respect to only those 6 items. But the other schools, the 4 schools in particular, the among the Sunnis, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'is, and Hanbalis, they say that these items mentioned in this hadith, they're just simply analogs for other items which fall in the same category. They fall under the same class or species, or same class of these items, right? So for instance, we find the Hanafis who say that when you look at these 2 classes, the gold and silver in one class, and then the wheat, barley, dates, and salt in the second class, that fundamentally Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has divided them on the basis of weight and volume. It wasn't a kili. In other words, anything that is weighed, like gold and silver, is also subject to the rules of riba, according to the Hanafis. And anything that is measured in the way that wheat, barley, dates, and salt are measured also is subject to the rules of riba, those 4 rules that are mentioned. But then we come to Malikis and the Shafi'is. When it comes to gold and silver, they differ with the Hanafis. They say, well, no, that weight is not the class under which gold and silver are classified. That gold and silver are classified under the class of being currency, or what they call jinsul athmani, the classification of prices, right, or the appraisal metric for other things, right? So anything that is a appraisal metric for other things are subject to the rules of riba. So in other words, that we like dollars, right? So paper money or digital money, they become appraisal metric, a metric for determining the value of other things. Then the rules of riba should apply to that. If we were to rely upon the rule of the Hanafis, the Hanafi classification, then paper money technically should not be subject to the rules of riba, because we don't weigh paper money. We don't exchange money on the basis of weight. And then when we bring into the conversation the digital money, then it's a totally other issue altogether as well. So the Malikis and Shafi'is are in agreement that the reason for gold and silver being listed because they are the appraisal metric for other items. But when it comes to the other four items, the food goods that are listed, they differ about like why those things are subject to the rules of riba as well, right? So the Shafi'is say, well, it's because these things are edibles. Mathematics said, no, it was because these things are non-perishables and they're staples, non-perishable staples, and that's the reason for it. And the Hanbalis, they agree with the Hanafis on those particular points. In other words, the point being that determining something to be riba is not an easy task, right? Not as easy as people often typically think. So this is my final slide here, right? So there are some discontinuities that do exist between classical understanding of riba and the way that we take riba today. So for instance, a gold and silver coinage are no longer foundational to economic activity today. So that being the case, that when we start to say that, for instance, paper money is subject to the rules of riba, then we have to decide, okay, well, what are paper money analogous with? Gold or silver, right? And then our paper money is not backed by gold or silver anymore to begin with, right? And so the question becomes: is an exchange of $1 for $2? Technically, is it really an example of riba, right? If we were to utilize that standard, you say it's equal to gold and silver. Now, for Shafis and Malikis, sure, it would be, right? Definitely. But for the Hanafis, at least the classical understanding of the Hanafi, it would not be, because gold and silver coinage are not foundational to economic activity. So not only because only about 4% of the currency in circulation, at least dollars in circulation, is cash, but the vast majority of money in circulation is actually digital, right? So which opens up another difficulty altogether. Another problem is that there's a high percentage of, I mentioned this, a high percentage of transactions today are digital. And then also because today's commodity currencies are commodities, that dollars are like a normal commodity, or yen or rupees, and all these things are commodities, and that itself poses certain challenges as well. There's a difficulty of doing an accurate appraisal, right? With respect to the standard of fiat money, we talked about that. With regard to, okay, what we're going to utilize gold or silver as a standard. Schools of law differ about the ratio legis, as we talked about just a minute ago, which has also made the issue very difficult to really speak in black or white terms about what is a riba transaction or a usurious transaction, which one is not. And then we add on top of this the traditional Hanafi classification of non-Islamic territories into Dar al-Salam and Dar al-Harb is also important, because according to that understanding, if you're living in Dar al-Harb, la riba fi Dar al-Harb, there's no riba extracted or paid. In other words, there's no sin, or riba doesn't apply to Dar al-Harb. Right? So if we were to classify non-Muslim countries as Dar al-Harb, and then it will be lawful, according to the old understanding, to actually both pay and to charge riba without incurring any sin. Right, and then lastly, there's a certain limitation to be found in what we call Shari'ah compliance in the Islamic finance sector, which fundamentally means is that, take for instance, if an individual borrows money from an Islamic finance company, then that individual, may lose the capacity to repay the debt, to pay the loan, right, that they borrow from the Islamic finance company. And quite often what happens is the same thing that would happen in conventional finance, where an individual would be foreclosed on or their item will be repossessed. And that in itself doesn't seem to be in the spirit of the verses of the Quran, which we recited at the very beginning, and in particular the part where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if one happens to be in straits, then time will be allotted or respite will be given to them until they are well-to-do. In other words, if an individual loses his job or her job and has a mortgage that he or she is paying, then it should not be the right of the mortgage company to actually their item or their asset, especially considering the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions this as being a rule. But when a Muslim finance company actually comes and repossesses the item, claiming that the individual missed the payment, or to even charge a late fee, regardless of what name you call the late fee, that both situations make those particular types of services not Sharia compliant in my viewpoint. At any rate, now that's all we have. And I hope there's some benefit that came from it. I know it could be a bit technical, but this is an important discussion to have today, because it's not as easy as people often think for them to determine what is actually riba and what is not, because of the different opinions among the ulama that exist. So, if there are any questions, I'll questions that you may have, inshallah. Use to read the look through here. Oh, thank you, Sister Zaina. So also the United States, let's look at this. Is it a question? And the United States has a stable food and energy supply. Without that, credit is useless. And think about that. So the United States has a stable food and energy supply. Without the credit is useless. Without that, credit is useless. That's probably true. I think that is true. That when we talked about the issue of debt and indebtedness, that other countries, many of them don't have a stable food supply, right? So it's easier to offer credit, when you do have stable food supply. Without stable food supply, of course, you're not going to have a stable country to begin with, right? So also most commodities in the world are priced in US dollars. True, right? Because the US dollar is the world reserve currency, and then also the petrodollar. So both of those facts actually give the dollar its strength. And so people quite often, when they're purchasing, making major purchases, that they need to first purchase dollars, and that in itself increases the value or the buying power, purchasing power of the dollar. Although that is something which is changing, and that's one of those things that we're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow, inshallah, with Brother Zishan, inshallah, Zishan Mukhtar. Okay, I mean, I'm looking. I'm not seeing any questions here. So, are we good? Okay, here's one. Would you restate the problem of Islamic finance? Well, the fundamental problem in Islamic finance, I would say, well, I mean, there are multiple problems in Islamic finance. Well, what I focus on towards the end was just simply the whole problem of a foreclosure, for instance. So, and without mentioning any particular companies, Islamic finance companies, but what happens is that an individual, let's say if you get into what they call the sort of the partnership option, like with Islamic finance company, so you identify a home, you decide that you want to go and get a Sharia compliant loan, right, from an Islamic finance company. So you go to them, and then you give them a quote that was given to you, and then they do a markup, and then they they say, okay, well, this is the new price of that home, and you give us 20, 30%, 40% of the price down. You give that to us, right? And we'll cover the rest of it. So you go into this contract, and then they tell you, okay, well, you're buying the shares that we own, right, over the life of the life of the contract itself, right? So you're just buying back, so we own this item together, and you're buying it back from us over this period of time. Now, but the problem is that if me, as the individual who gave the initial down payment to the Islamic finance company, if I fall into some financial hardship, first and foremost, they're going to charge me a late fee, right? Which they call it by a different name, which is a late fee. It's not usually a very large amount, but still it's a late fee. And I would say that's exactly what riba is. I know riba, right? To charge a late fee. That's a riba. I'm in hardship. Why would you charge me more, right? I've lost my job. And why are you charging me more because I'm late? I'm late because I don't have any money, right? I don't have a job. But then if I don't, regain the capacity to continue to pay my mortgage, then what happens is that you go into the process of foreclosure, which again, they may call by a different name, right? Even there's a claim that, okay, they're sharing the loss with you. Now, the problem with that is, as I stated before, is that, well, if I'm simply buying, your shares in the actual home back from you, then you should have the ability to give me a proper compliant loan, or meaning that because I'm now in hardship, that you should suspend the payments that are due on my mortgage. But the fact that you will continue in the process of giving me late payment after late payment, and then eventually foreclosing on the item, pretty much tells me that something is happening in the background, which you're not completely being transparent about to me. Which what's happening is the company has actually done nothing more than go and utilize your money as a down payment for a conventional mortgage loan, which they would argue that is haram, the haram option, right? Right. So in other words, again, there are other things I could say, but hopefully that clarifies the fundamental point, because again, the Quran says that, that you have a right to your seed money, to your capital that you gave at the beginning. If you gave 1,000, you don't have to write back for that 1,000. And if the person fall into straits, temporal difficulty, then you should give the person respite, right? Give them some time until they get back on their feet, right? But if an Islamic finance company is claiming that they're Sharia compliant, and they're actually not giving an individual the time to get back on their feet and to resume their payments, and then move to foreclose, then that in itself that's not, to me, it's not Sharia compliant, because the Quran is very clear about what the teachings of Islam are on that particular point. So Samar says, I say, my 11-year-old son is asking if it is considered riba if one trades an item with an item of less value and both parties agree. Well, trading itself, for instance, if item for item, let's say if those two items are different from one another, let's say, for instance, I barter a cow for a sheep. It's halal, right? This is a halal barter, right? But the cow, the individual at the moment may not think that the cow is equal to, or is more valuable. I'll say they may not think that the time that the cow is more valuable than a sheep. It all depends on what you want at that moment, right? But this is one of the things that led to the introduction of currency, of money itself. Was born out of these type of problems. Is that, okay, well, you walk away, you say, you know what? Actually, that cow is 3-4 times as big as my sheep, right? So he has a whole lot more meat than I do, right? On this thing that I traded him a cow up, something of greater value for something of less value. It is how to do so, right? But because of people's sense of being defrauded, human beings, they created money, right? A medium of exchange. In other words, they say, well, I'm going to give you this cash, right? Instead of trading that sheep for that cow, or that apple pie for that cherry pie, right? Whatever it may be. You might like apple pies, and you trade your apple pie for cherry pie. You may not like cherry pies that much, right? So uh, so that's it's permissible. So he's asking that. So yes, it's permissible for you to do so, but you might want to consider selling the item first for money, and then just or asking for money for your item, and or giving him money for his item. Um, so and also a follow up. After fixed interest investment vehicles are fixed interest investment vehicles, bonds, GICs considered riba. Well, the issue of fixed investment is, of course, definitely has been a problem. So, say, for instance, Sheikh Ali Pantawi, rahimahullah, some years ago, he gave a fatwa about collecting interest on bank deposits, right? And his fatwa was that it's permissible to collect interest on bank deposits, because there's an agreed upon profit that's been offered to the individual who places their money into the bank. Now, most of the ulama, they disagree with this and said that this is scandalous, that this itself was fundamentally validating or legitimizing riba, right? Because if you go into a business deal with an individual, go into a business venture, and you're a partner to that individual, then you should be able to share in the profits, not have a fixed sort of profit given to you by the individual. That you should be able to, whatever money that's made, it's exploitative for them to do so. So because of it being exploitative is usually the main reason why they would say this is a problem. On the other hand, if we were to adjust the arrangement in such a way that we know that all the ulama are in agreement about, and that's to say that, okay, well, what if the bank decides that, okay, that your monies, we're gonna utilize portions of your money in order to invest in certain projects, and we're gonna give you a dividend each time we actually from these projects. To my knowledge, all the ulama have that's fine. It's nothing. That's not a problem with that. In other words, both are examples of profit, except that in one situation, there's a cap placed on how much you can actually earn. In the other situation, there's not a cap placed on how much you can earn, right? So, and I'm just want to give you that as a principle that you can utilize to, and so bonds, generally speaking, are halal if the items that are invested in are considered to be halal for a Muslim to own, right? But not if there are not halal, So, and if you don't know what you're investing in, then it's better for you not to invest in those items. So, Bilal Hakim, Jazakallah khair, any thoughts on the concept of Shari'ah arbitrage, where there may be elements of riba in the contract that are engineered such that the consumer does not directly deal with it? Well, yeah. I mean, Sharia arbitrage is very common among Islamic finance companies, and they hire muftis and as regulators to an extent, individuals who validate the contracts, or they look at the forms of different contracts and say that the language of those contracts are valid and there's nothing un-Islamic about them. As a principle, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no problem with offering that service to the banks and the finance companies to validate the contract is Islamic or not, because not every Muslim has a legal knowledge necessary for them to know whether or not everything that they become involved in is halal, right? So to put their reliance upon an expert is what we're supposed to do, right? We put the فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. We ask the people of knowledge when you don't know. Right. So, the question really is more so about, how much time do the arbiters actually do spend every single year, actually looking closely at the documents of all of those institutions, and so that in itself is in doubt about whether or not they actually do that. That some have raised that before, that that it may be impossible, probably impossible, to actually for them to actually look at all the necessary documentation, which actually is published by these financial institutions every year in order for them to validate them as being Islamically permissible or Sharia compliant. Wallahu a'lam. Can you comment on the concept of genuine needs when engaging in contracts that may involve riba? I feel that this concept is sometimes thrown around casually. Right? So genuine need, well, the word for need in Arabic is haja, right? And when we look at the maqasid of Shari'ah, the maqasid generally referred or divided into what we call the daruriyat, al-hajiyat, and the tahsiniyat. Now, a haja fundamentally is translated as something without which one would be in hardship. But a darura is something without which one would not survive. And so both of them are examples of needs. So genuine need is something without which I would not survive, or something without which I would live in a state of hardship. All right. If that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So so unless it's one of those two definitions, then you don't have genuine need in this situation, right? So so for instance, there are some people who believe that education is necessary, and so they choose a school whose tuition they're not able to afford with their particular family, and they'll say, well, Islam makes it an obligation for one to seek knowledge, and the only way I'm going to get this knowledge is for me to go to university. So I have to take out a student loan. And I would say no, that's not a valid rationalization, the right rationale. That's not a need in this situation. That's a want, because there are many different universities that one can choose to go to. Right? Some of them are affordable, and others are not affordable. Right? So you can choose an affordable university, if you're not able to procure, of course, a scholarship, etc. Right? Or an Islamic loan, a halal loan, which doesn't charge interest. But again, just an example of the need. Jazakallah khair. Thanks. Same to you. Yes. Are there any other questions? Maybe take one or two more. And if not, that's fine as well. You can conclude here. But I do appreciate everyone signing on today. All right. Okay. Well, it looks like we've covered a lot, covered enough, sufficient enough. And do come back tomorrow. Tomorrow, inshallah, it'll be more of a conversation as opposed to a lesson like we had today. But I did think that it was important to have this introduction to this important topic, because I imagine it's going to come up again tomorrow. And I wanted people to be properly prepped for that conversation as we talk about something which is a bit more technical with respect to banking and cryptocurrency, among other things. Barakallahu fikum wa sallallahu sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.